Hello and welcome to our video on mergers, acquisitions and TUPE, immigration considerations for employers. My name is Adele Standard and I'm a Senior Associate in the immigration team at Fox Williams. This video is largely relevant to entities involved in a merger or acquisition where one or both of the parties holds a sponsor license. We will discuss the corresponding obligations to ensure any sponsored migrants maintain their right to work in the UK and to ensure that the sponsor license holders comply with their sponsor duties. We will also cover right to work check implications, which will apply to any employer involved in a merger or acquisition, regardless of whether they hold a sponsor license or not. Please note the topics discussed and the information provided in this video are correct at the time of recording, but subject to change. So when do immigration considerations arise in a merger or acquisition? The first thing to consider in terms of immigration implications in a merger or acquisition is whether either of the parties, the buyer or the seller, has a sponsor license and if any migrants are being transferred. If the seller has a sponsor license and is transferring sponsored migrants, obligations arise for both parties, the seller and the buyer. The seller must report both the merger or acquisition and the transfer of migrants within 20 working days to the Home Office via the sponsor management system. The buyer, if it has a license, must also report the merger or acquisition and acceptance of the migrants within 20 working days. Sponsor licenses are not transferable, and therefore if the buyer does not have a license, it must apply for one within 20 working days in order to be able to accept the transfer of any sponsored migrants moving over. Once granted, the buyer must make the same reports to the Home Office on the sponsor management system. Once the reports have been made to the Home Office will likely ask for supporting documents to evidence the change, such as a share purchase agreement. As licenses are not transferable, if the seller is completely taken over or sold, its license will be revoked or made dormant, depending on whether migrants have transferred. It's worth noting that a merger or acquisition will only trigger the requirement to report where the direct owner of the entity that holds a sponsor license is changing. If the change of ownership is for an entity one or more removed from the sponsor license holder, the change does not need to be reported. Usually, where a sponsored worker moves to a new employer, they're required to make a change of employment application, essentially a new visa application for leave to remain before they can start work. Where a sponsored worker transfers to a new company under TUPE or similar provisions, however, their sponsorship also transfers, so they're not required to make a new application. So what is TUPE? When a business changes owner or another business takes over part of it or a service it provides, its employees may be protected under the Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment Regulations 2006, TUPE. In general terms, this means that the employees' jobs transfer to the new company and their terms and conditions of employment remain the same. So what are similar provisions? Well, some workers are not covered under TUPE, such as staff working in the public sector, and non-employee staff, such as partners. Their sponsorship can still transfer to the new company when TUPE would normally apply. To ensure that sponsored workers maintain their right to work in the UK following a TUPE transfer or similar, the buyer must ensure that it applies for a sponsor license if necessary and makes the requisite reports within the 20 working day deadline. All UK employers are required to comply with Prevention of Illegal Working guidance and carry out right to work checks on all employees on or before their first day of work. Correctly conducting a right to work check establishes what is called a statutory excuse. This essentially means that should one of your employees turn out to not in fact have a right to work, for example if their permission is withdrawn without your knowledge, or in the event they have provided you with false documents, you'll be protected from incurring a civil penalty for illegally employing them. In the event of a merger or acquisition where TUPE applies and staff are transferring, although the right to work checks of the seller are deemed to have been carried out by the buyer, and therefore any statutory excuses are inherited by the buyer. If the seller did not carry out compliant checks, the buyer will also inherit liability for any penalties imposed. For that reason, it's best practice for the buyer to conduct their own right to work checks on transferring staff. There is a 60-day grace period after the transfer in which the buyer can carry out its own right to work checks and establish its own statutory excuse. So what happens when you get it wrong? If the buyer does not make a valid application for a sponsor license within 20 working days, or that application is refused, all of the migrants that transfer to the buyer will have their UK permission shortened to 60 calendar days. If they're unable to make an application for leave to remain before the 60 days is up, they and their any dependent family members will be required to leave the UK. If either of the parties do not make the relevant reports within 20 working days, the Home Office may take action against them. This could be suspension, downgrading, or revocation of their sponsor license. Failure to make the relevant reports could also lead to the migrants involved in the transfer having their UK permission shortened to 60 days. Where a sponsor license is revoked, again, the UK permission of all sponsored migrants will be shortened to 60 days. The consequences, therefore, can be very serious for both the business and affected sponsored migrants, as well as their families. It's therefore very important to get it right and seek advice in the event of a merger or acquisition where migrants are transferring. And that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please do get in touch with one of our team should you have any questions.